But when I came upon it is as a therapist working with family after family and observing that here were parents who had completed the checklist. They had financial success. They had emotional longevity in long-term relationships. They had arrived. And yet there was a deep dysfunction or deep disconnection between themselves and their children. So that led me to be curious, well, what is it? If it isn't what we think it is, success, money, marriage, stability, maturity, then what is it? And I began to see that it's this thing that I call consciousness, which is really the parent's inability to realize that there's this thing called conditioning that obscures the ability to see the child for who it is. But what this does, this immediate placement of a way to be, obscures the ability for the child to develop their way.
So that was a clip from Shefali Saberi's Impact Theory interview. It's one of the most phenomenal experiences I've ever had when dealing with the topic of parenting and youth autonomy and children's rights. Today I'm going to be taking a good look at Jordan B. Peterson's perspective and lens on those topics. So I just finished his book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, and I was really struck by Chapter 5. Don't let your kids do anything that makes you dislike them. When I first got into it, it was really confusing because he basically took all of his typical principles of standing up for the actualization of the individual and autonomy and human rights. He just threw all that out the window when it came to how he interacted with kids, and it suddenly became about domination of the child and child obedience. As I see it, his book is about the actualization of the individual so that you can take on the burden of being and pursue something worthwhile. To throw all of that out the window when it comes to children just means that we're going to continue to end up with young adults who, in their first experience of autonomy, have to go on this long existential journey through healing from childhood. So before I get into it, I'm just going to share another resource, Free to Learn by Dr. Peter Gray. And one of the quotes I want to share is where he analyzes the types of parenting. Trustful parents trust their children to play and explore on their own, to make their own decisions, to take risks, and learn from their own mistakes. Trustful parents are not negligent parents. They provide not just freedom, but also sustenance, love, respect, moral examples, and environmental conditions required for healthy development. The directive domineering style of parenting arose gradually with the rise of agriculture and reached its zenith during feudal and early industrial times. Unquestionable obedience to lords and masters during this time often meant the difference between life and death, so the goal of parenting shifted from that of creating free and independent people to that of creating subservient beings. Yet history tells us that directive domineering parenting has never been fully effective. Freedom is so strong a drive that can never be fully beaten out of a person, regardless of age. Directive protective parents do not limit children's freedom in order to force them into labor in fields or factories, or to make them servile, as directive domineering parents did. Rather, they limit freedom because they fear for their child's safety and futures, and believe they can make better decisions for them than the children can for themselves. With all good intentions, directive protective parents derive their children of freedom at least as much as did the directive domineering parenting of the past. While trustful parents believe that children develop best when allowed to play and explore on their own, directive protective parents believe that children develop best when they follow a path carefully laid out for them by adults. So Jordan has a particular aim and goal in mind. His goal is child obedience for the convenience of adults. And this breaks down in 3 ways. 1, no options. So when JBP doesn't have any other options, or he just doesn't have the creativity or the energy, he'll resort to dominance of the child, control, authoritarian discipline, that kind of thing. 2, he relies on convenience. He prioritizes the parent or adult's desires, wants, and perspectives over the kid in the situation. And it's not even that he's prioritizing the needs of the parent or adult in a way that is actually beneficial to them. He's focusing on their subjective desires and almost their lower mind, small mind as you might call it. The third part is socialization. Jordan needs some way to justify the authoritarian and disciplinarian style of parenting that he uses, because he knows that it mimicks the dictator-subordinate control in society. And so he has to have a damn good reason to use it, and he doesn't want to just rely on convenience and no other options. And so he uses socialization, where he believes that the child has to be molded, contained, controlled, wielded, crafted by the parent so they are socially acceptable by society. He says, first, why should a child be subject? In this case, subject to the dictates of the adult. That's easy. Every child must listen to and obey adults because he or she is dependent on the care that one or more imperfect grown-ups is willing to bestow. Given this, it is better for the child to act in a manner that invites genuine affection and goodwill. And he does have kind of a pragmatic understanding that most adults are suffering in ways that when they have kids or when kids are involved, they will just easily fall apart. They'll crumble and they'll just snap at the kids. They'll yell at them. The kids will be treated very poorly. And so he says this is a good reason for the children to craft themselves and their disposition, their personality in a way that is inviting and is sociable. And I'm going to contrast this with a couple of quotes from Shefali's book, The Conscious Parent. Traditional parenthood has been exercised in a manner that's hierarchical. The parent governs from top down. After all, isn't the child our lesser to be transformed by us as the more knowledgeable party? Because children are smaller and don't know as much as we do, we presume we are entitled to control them. Indeed, we are so used to the kind of family in which the parent exercises control, it perhaps doesn't even occur to us that this arrangement might not be good for ourselves or our children. In other words, while you may believe your most important challenge is to raise your children well, there's an even more essential task you need to attend to, which is the foundation of effective parenting. This task is to raise yourself into the most awakened and present individual you can be. The reason this is central to good parenting is that children don't need our ideas and expectations or our dominance and control, only for us to be attuned to them with our engaged presence. So I'm just going to go through his summary of principles. First principle is limit the rules. Principle 2, use minimum necessary force. Number 3, parents should come in pairs. And the fourth principle is kind of interesting. Parents should understand their own capacity to be harsh, vengeful, arrogant, resentful, angry, and deceitful. That's one of the best quotes of the entire chapter. Between that and the first two principles, I started to get this idea that he does fall into the authoritarian parenting, but he wants to hold himself back and corral himself as much as possible, and at least he's willing to acknowledge that there's the capacity for evil within parents. And then the fifth principle is parents have a duty to act as proxies to the real world. It is the primary duty of parents to make their children socially desirable. This will provide the child with opportunity, self-regard, and security. It's even more important than fostering individual identity. That holy grail can only be pursued in any case after a high degree of social sophistication has been established. I'm going to contrast that with Shefali's perspective, which just shows the complete opposite. And Dr. Gray's perspective, too, is that children absolutely need the space to explore and to play, and that's how they develop their own skills, and that's how they develop their personality and self-assurance, self-control, autonomy, strength of character. That's how they're able to take on the world. So I'm going to read another quote on page 122, just to give more emphasis on that. Children can be damaged as much or more by a lack of incisive attention as they are by abuse, mental or physical. This damage is by omission rather than commission, but it is no less severe and long-lasting. Children are damaged when their mercifully inattentive parents fail to make them sharp and observant and awake, and leave them instead in an unconscious and undifferentiated state. So this really clarifies it, because he even suggests that if children are not socialized by their parents and molded externally and extrinsically by adults, then they will be unconscious and undifferentiated. They will be left as uncarved blocks, trapped in a perpetual state of waiting to be. He also conflates neglectful parenting here with trustful parenting, which was already negated in Dr. Gray's opening quote about trustful parenting. And so he tends to blur the lines with that, because he generally comes back to the punitive parenting, because that's what he's dependent on. And anything outside of punitive parenting, he just assumes is permissive and neglectful. Now, I'm going to read a quote from Shefali's book on page 3. Instead of meeting the individual needs of our children, we tend to project our own ideas and expectations onto them. Even when we have the best of intentions of encouraging our children to be their true selves, most of us unwittingly fall into the trap of imposing our agenda on them. Consequently, the parent-child relationship frequently deadens a child's spirit instead of enlivening it. This is a key reason so many of our children grow up troubled and in many cases plagued by dysfunction. So I'm just going to take another look at something that Dr. Gray says here, just for one other comparison. On page 5, towards right at the beginning of Dr. Gray's book, he says, lack of free play may not kill the physical body as would lack of food, air, or water, but it kills the spirit and stunts mental growth. Free play is the means by which children learn to make friends, overcome their fears, solve their own problems, and generally take control of their own lives. It is also the primary means by which children practice and acquire the physical and intellectual skills that are essential for success in the culture in which they are growing. Nothing that we do, no amount of toys we buy or quality time or special training we give our children can compensate for the freedom we take away. The things that children learn through their own initiatives in free play cannot be taught in other ways. So that really hits the nail on the head right there. That's the nail in the coffin. That no matter how much you provide other things for your children, the support, financial stability, resources, it doesn't take away their need for autonomy. That is one of the vital needs. And it doesn't just, no matter how much you give them as far as material goods go or parental support, it doesn't justify controlling them. It doesn't justify disregarding or violating their autonomy, which is cruel, and it's shockingly damaging. It's probably one of the most damaging experiences a human being can have, is to feel their autonomy is threatened. Also, we're going to compare what Dr. Gray just said to Peterson's quote on page 132. The fundamental moral question is not how to shelter children completely from misadventure and failure so they never experience any fear or pain, but how to maximize their learning so that useful knowledge may be gained with minimal cost. He does acknowledge that protecting children in the directive protective parenting style is really damaging because he emphasizes competence and responsibility and will give kids challenges and opportunities. So in the very beginning of the chapter, on page 113, he shares a story about two parents that were following their toddler around very closely as the toddler went around and explored. And he says on page 114, the desire of his parents to let their child act without correction on every impulse perversely produced precisely the opposite effect. They deprived him instead of every opportunity to engage in independent action. Because they did not dare teach him what no means, he had no conception of the reasonable limits enabling maximal toddler autonomy. It was a classic example of too much chaos breeding too much order and the inevitable reversal. So first, he makes it sound like he's watching these strangers in public and he's only seen them once, but assumes that the parents are doing this every time, or they're just letting their child act without correction. And then that also therefore assumes that the child's actions every time are impulsive. He differentiates between impulse and independent action. So before socialization, a very young child is impulsive when they're exploring. So their natural drives to free play and exploration that evolved over millions of years, it's just impulsive. And then after socialization, suddenly their choices become independent action, even at the age of a toddler. And so then he says, because they did not dare teach him what no means. So he doesn't explain what he means by that. He just throughout the chapter repeats this, and there's little tidbits that give you insight into what he actually means. He essentially views the word no as this holy grail of disciplinarian parenting, and he'll try to train a child almost in a Pavlovian sense, where he uses the word no with a punishment repeatedly, and then after a while the child will respond just to the word no. And so it's no as a tool of control of the child's behavior. I'm going to skip to page 139. A parent can only say no to a child who wants a third piece of cake because he or she is larger, stronger, and more capable than the child, and additionally backed up by authority by the state and law. What no means in the final analysis is always, if you continue to do that, something you do not like will happen to you. Otherwise, it means nothing. Or worse, it means another nonsensical nothing muttered by ignorable adults. Or worse still, it means all adults are ineffectual and weak. Now that's pretty revealing right there. It reveals more an insecurity of himself as the parent in a position of authority, where he has to bolster himself up as the authoritarian to actually feel a sense of worth, that to a point where if he didn't follow up no with punishment, suddenly he's weak. And I don't know if that's how the child is going to interpret it. At this point, I'm just going to mention that he has a tendency to conflate the child's will for autonomy and self-direction with the child trying to dominate the parent. And this is actually psychological projection, because he is actually trying to dominate the child. And then when the child says no in their own way, or feels pain or cries or refuses, he ignores it. Peterson exemplifies in page 139 and 140 that I just read that when you're reliant or dependent on punishment and control of the child, both of you are disempowered. Because now you have to rely on that, because you know that the child is just going to rebel more and more, and that pain builds up residually over time. Instead, maybe you could focus on what you actually need, because your needs are important too. The child's needs are important. Your needs as the parent are important. And you can use negotiation, and you can be open and honest about what you're actually experiencing and going through. But maybe that's hard to do, because when the child is in pain and they're suffering, you tend to punish them. So then when you're in pain and you're suffering, do you punish yourself? And then how does that child grow up after having those experiences and learning that way? I would suggest that there are other options than using no in a dictatorial sense. That a child, when they say no, you can also respect it. If it has to do with their body, has to do with their choices, you can say, okay. And you say, honey, do you want a hug? And they say no. And you say, all right, that's fine. That's another way of learning no. So now we're going to take a closer look at Peterson's tendency to project dominance onto the child. In this case, we mean that he perceives the child's will for self-direction as an attempt to dominate him, the parent, when he's the one who's actually trying to dominate the child in the first place. Imagine a toddler repeatedly striking his mother in the face. Why would he do such a thing? It's a stupid question. It's unacceptably naive. The answer is obvious. To dominate his mother. To see if he can get away with it. Violence, after all, is no mystery. It's peace that's the mystery. Violence is the default. Yes. So he simply just assumed that the child just wants to dominate his mother. But the thing is, again, when the child is developing physically like that, they may not have developed the conscious empathy yet to understand that people really wouldn't like being hit like that. It just doesn't occur to him when he's a toddler. And the other thing, though, is that as the kid gets older, if that continues to happen, then that's usually a sign of abuse. It's usually a sign of the child going through something that is major suffering that is really needs to be addressed. And the way to address it is not to abuse your child in return. It's not, you hit me, I hit you. That's only going to make matters much worse. Just like Jordan needs other tools in his toolbox to be able to use more peaceful ways of interacting with children, children need tools in their toolbox to have peaceful ways of interacting with other people. So now we're going to look at page 128, and here's another example. Scared parents think that a crying child is always sad or hurt. This is simply not true. Anger is one of the most common reasons for crying. Anger crying and fear crying, or sadness crying, do not look the same. They also don't sound the same and can be distinguished with careful attention. Anger crying is often an act of dominance and should be dealt with as such. It implies that it's just known that the child is suffering, and the way they're responding is simply motivated maliciously to try to dominate and control the parent. And this is really perverse. This is really a perverse interpretation of a child's suffering. If you interpret a child's suffering that way automatically, or that's one of your default positions, then most likely you're going to respond to them very poorly and not empathically at all. Because he's the adult in the situation, ideally, he would be the one that would be leading by example, by empathizing with the child's pain and empathizing with their suffering. After all, the world is full of suffering. JBP knows this. He emphasizes it. And if that's the case, then perhaps it's a lot more innocent that the child is in pain after experiencing a punishment or some circumstance in their life. It can be extremely painful. Because if you yelled at your kid and they respond that way, are they really the one trying to dominate you? You may not even be trying to dominate your kid in this case. You might have just snapped. You might have just been really stressed out and in a lot of pain and suffering yourself. When you're in pain and suffering and you snap at somebody, are you trying to dominate that person? Or are you simply hoping for more space in your life to have your needs met? Are you a man starving in the desert, hoping for water after much suffering? It is the human condition, and children are not separate from that. So I was really just awestruck by how contradictory Jordan's perspective is and his lenses regarding children as compared to his general lens for morality, philosophy, society, the suffering of individual man. And I'm like, how could he have such profound cognitive dissonance over this? And then it occurred to me, just like hit me. He perceives children more as objects to be organized and ordered in your life as the individual parent than as human beings. And I don't think he necessarily realizes that this is a resulting perspective, but it seems to be kind of a subconscious thing. To put it another way, he wants you to clean up your kids like you clean up your room. It's all about this pragmatic control of the child, and again, that comes back to the convenience of the adults. I want to emphasize this and get into his head and exemplify that. I'm just going to take some quotes from page 143 towards the end. A properly socialized 3-year-old is polite and engaging. She's also no pushover. She evokes interest from other children and appreciation from adults. She exists in a world where kids welcome her and compete for her attention, where adults are happy to see her instead of hiding behind false smiles. She will be introduced to the world by people who are pleased to do so. This will do more for her eventual individuality than any cowardly parental attempt to avoid day-to-day conflict and discipline. It's almost as if he's fantasizing about this wonderful child that is the product of the parental crafting and molding. And again, he implies that when a parent avoids discipline, then they're also going to avoid conflict. And I would say that top-down control is actually a way of avoiding conflict. It's taking a very simple route out just by yelling and screaming until you get your way, or by maybe doing so calmly, but still setting these really hard lines that don't take into account the needs of the child, or even your own needs as the parent. It's all about convenience based on your subjective desires. And considering parents have a variety of different desires, that may not always be good for them. It's almost as if we're playing Russian roulette, and whatever the child is born into, that's what they're going to get. Let's read just a little bit further down on 144. A child who pays attention instead of drifting, and can play, and does not whine, and is comical but not annoying, and is trustworthy, that child will have friends wherever he goes. His teachers will like him, and so will his parents. If he attends politely to adults, he will be attended to, smiled at, and happily instructed. He will thrive in what can so easily be a cold, unforgiving, and hostile world. Yeah, it's just such a fantasy. It's such a ridiculous fantasy. I mean, earlier in the chapter, he criticizes Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his idea of the noble savage and the unadulterated, perfect, innocent child that's born that way, and yet JBP goes into his own fantasy of the perfect child post-socialization. And the reality is that it just doesn't go that way. So I'm going to compare his quote with something from another book here. This is Unconditional Parenting by Elfie Kohn, and he is scrutinizing rewards and punishment. When kids do something inappropriate, most of us feel a need to take some action rather than doing nothing. Therefore, if our repertoire is limited to punishment, that's what we end up doing by default. The first thing to understand is that rewards are remarkably ineffective at improving the quality of people's work or learning. A considerable number of studies have found that children and adults alike are less successful at many tasks when they're offered a reward for doing them, or for doing them well.
Why did this happen?
Well, one reason is because if the kid figures if they have to bribe me to do this, it must be something I wouldn't want to do. So the very act of offering a reward for a behavior signals to somebody, this is not something interesting. The second reason I think this happens is because rewards are ways of controlling kids and adults. So we don't like to be controlled, and we feel that our behavior is being pulled by the reward. We're not in the driver's seat, and so we tend to lose interest in the whole enterprise because we would rather be the origins of our behavior rather than be manipulated by goodies.
So what should we be saying?
Well, rewards, like punishments, are ways of doing things to people. I think the alternative is to be working with people.
So that really kind of blows out the window, basically, most of what Peterson says about using reward and punishment. It's really amazing that so many parents believe in the use of it, even as it gets less effective over time. Most parents that rely on these punitive types of parenting never give themselves the opportunities to explore other ways of interacting with their children, and they don't even realize the benefits and the actual results of peacefully negotiating with your children, actually being a full human being where you're not constantly fulfilling this caricatural role of a dictator, and just like playing with your children and being open and giving space. Now, Peterson actually does have some awareness of some of the damaging effects of reward and punishment. He says, deprivation of liberty causes pain in a manner essentially similar to that of physical trauma. The same can be said of the use of social isolation, including time out. We know this neurobiologically. The same brain areas mediate responses to all three, and are ameliorated by the same class of drugs, opiates. So he says that it's deprivation of liberty is as similar to that of physical trauma. I'm going to replace the word liberty with autonomy here. So now that we know that it's traumatizing, why would you do that to your kids ever? If it's traumatizing, then you're actually stunting the growth of your child. And most likely they're going to grow up and they're going to be parenting through that trauma and continuing that cycle. And this is the cycle of unconsciousness in human beings. And it's tragic and it's heartbreaking and it's no life worth living. This is continuing a lot of unnecessary suffering, simply by being unwilling to take a good look at yourself and your own limitations and the experience of becoming a parent. When it's overwhelming, when it's you, the child, and society, and all three of those clash in a giant whirlwind, it gets very, very scary to actually take an honest look at your own suffering and the challenges before you. But that's what Shefali talks about in The Conscious Parent, and so you might want to pay attention to what she says. We're going to go to page 141 here with a story of escalating punishments. If your child is the kind of determined varmint who simply runs away laughing when placed on the steps or in his room, physical restraint might have to be added to the timeout routine. A child can be held carefully but firmly by the upper arms until he or she stops squirming and pays attention. If that fails, being turned over a parent's knee might be required. For the child who is pushing the limits in a spectacularly inspired way, a swat across the backside can indicate requisite seriousness on the part of a responsible adult. That was the point where I had to put the book down. I had to take a break because I was recognizing that a person that has this profound wisdom and skill, the person that I admired, was espousing such an unempathic and cruel way of interacting with children. Because I immediately empathize with the child in this scenario on a level where I imagine myself as the kid. And immediately my reaction was, why didn't you ask me what I was experiencing? Why didn't you ask me why I was reacting that way, what I was feeling? Anything. Ask some questions. Try to understand before you try to force a kid to act a certain way. So his daughter had rheumatoid arthritis, and she got it. She was diagnosed when she was like 8 years old, and so he'll go through that story at different points, and he keeps going back to it at different stages. It's a really powerful story. And so they take Mikhaila is his daughter's name. They take her to a bunch of different doctors, and she gets diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And this is pretty interesting. And he says, on 342. We wanted Mikhaila to control as much of her life as she could. She'd always been strongly motivated by money. I sat her down one evening and told her that I would give her $50 if she could do the injection herself. She was 8. And this was an injection of some medicine that she was prescribed. And so that's just another good example of Jordan's kind of responsibility as offering of autonomy and support. Now this is actually a really interesting quote. In this chapter, he says, when existence reveals itself as existentially intolerable, thinking collapses in on itself. In such situations, in the depths, it's noticing, not thinking, that does the trick. So he's getting really close to observation and therefore consciousness. And this is exactly the type of awakening that Shefali talks about. So then her disease had gotten better for a while, and then it started to get worse again. And so on page 350... the damaged ankle produced much more pain than her previously failing hip. One bad night she became erratic and illogical. I couldn't calm her down. I knew she was at her breaking point.
To call that stressful is to say almost nothing. I'm reading that story just as an example of showing Peterson actually recognizing the pain and suffering of a kid as she's growing up and actually being very supportive and just being very heroic. And he goes through all of these processes of um, his own internal suffering and confronting that so he actually has the capacity to take it on as a family. And I'm bringing that up because imagine if he hadn't empathized with her pain. Remember what he said about deprivation of autonomy, and even then he supported it. Remember what he said about anger crying and dominating the parent. She may have suffered a lot more. And this is a very personal point of the topic to actually look at his own family because he has actually been so transparent. And I don't want to be harsh or cruel or abrupt and abrasive about this because it's clearly such an intense topic, and that particular story about his daughter, I mean, it's just this lifelong familial existential experience of getting through suffering. And the way that he handled it sounds like there was some really, really powerful experiences there. And that is where you have the conscious awakening. This is where awakening in the path of consciousness is directly tied to how you interact with your own children and how your kids interact with you. So, in summary, Jordan's aim or goal is child obedience for the convenience of the adult, not necessarily the needs of the parent or the adult, but for their convenience, with no real further or deeper analysis on whether it's really beneficial. Second, he lacks empathy and openness to the child's needs and suffering. And that really is what propels him into this constant dependence on punitive parenting. And thirdly, he conflates child autonomy with their attempt at dominating the parent. And this prevents him from empathizing with the child further. I would like to offer some other perspectives that I'm forming that I think may be more helpful to parents in actually taking on not only the burden of their own being and their own conscious awakening, but also pursuing parenting and how they interact with their children in a productive and peaceful manner. I want to offer as many tools and as much insight as possible. I'm not going to leave you in the dark and criticize the only tool in your toolbox and leave you with nothing else. I would like to suggest that childhood play, and the will for self-determination in the child that can sometimes be chaotic and exciting and high energy, to try viewing that as a resource and not a burden. That you could see that one of the few resources that you actually have in this experience of daily suffering is your child's playfulness. That they're the ones who haven't been crushed and overburdened by society yet. And all you need to do is try to find a positive outlet for that playfulness. I want to look at the social infrastructure and the physical infrastructure of society. And it's kind of generalized, but I have a forming hypothesis. This is fairly new, and I want to throw it out there that the way that society's infrastructure and the social network or web is formed is antithetical to the needs of the child, and therefore the needs of the family and the parent. If we can look at the social framework and we can look at each person's needs, because that's what forms this social framework, instead of looking at the child as the problem, then we can actually try to understand the needs of each person. And in understanding what's really happening, then we will see overlap in ways that people can meet each other's needs more peacefully. And that means that you'll find yourself less in situations where your kids are a problem and more in situations where they actually have a place in the context. Try to empathize with your kids, even in situations where you feel like you can't make those changes and you feel helpless. Just being willing to feel your pain and your suffering is a noble step. It's amazing. And then to be able to extend that to your kids, also amazing. Maybe in this exploration, you find yourself at times still coming back to punitive parenting because of how much society is structured towards that still in kind of a dependent, trapped, traumatized way. At those times, if you can just empathize with your child and be supportive of them as you process that with your child after the situation is over, then they'll actually be able to empathize with you more and your limitations.
All right, that's it. Here it is. Here's the end. Thank you for watching. I wish you all the best of luck in your adventures in cleaning up your rooms and organizing chaos. So let's go out in style with a quote from The end of chapter 4.
Realization is dawning. Instead of playing the tyrant, therefore, you are paying attention. You are telling the truth instead of manipulating the world. You are negotiating instead of playing the martyr or the tyrant. You no longer have to be envious, because you no longer know that someone else truly has it better. You no longer have to be frustrated, because you have learned to aim low and to be patient. You are discovering who you are and what you want and what you are willing to do. You are finding the solutions to your particular problems that have been tailored to you personally and precisely. You are less concerned with the actions of other people, because you have plenty to do yourself. Attend to the day, but aim at the highest good.